think it's astounding how important brewing was in the Victorian industrial era. Brewing was the second biggest industry in terms of contribution to GDP in the second half of the 19th century.
Certainly the medical profession was becoming much more interested in drink consumption in the 19th century, and theories of disease, which had different names, began to come on the scene.
I think what we see in this period in particular is the emergence of new ways of thinking about alcohol and new ways of understanding alcohol's relationship to the sort of incipient problems that people seem to see around them.
Today, we're jumping forward to the 19th century to look at the role of alcohol in the world's first industrial society. This is a moment when it becomes possible to mass produce alcohol cheaply. Brewers and distillers are at the forefront of innovation, pushing the boundaries in terms of new scientific and production techniques.
But it's also a moment when the explosion of cheap alcohol and places to sell and drink it prompts reformers to try to force the state to regulate people's health and drinking habits. I'm Professor Phil Withington.
And I'm Dr. Nick Grote, and you're listening to 5.5 Moments When Alcohol Shaped the World. Our fifth moment charts the religious, political, medical and moral response to the alcohol problem in the industrial era. And Phil will be investigating the emergence of the biostate in 19th century Britain.
Hello, I'm in the engine room at Callum Island Museum in the old heart of industrial Sheffield, looking at the River Don steam engine, the most powerful working steam engine in Europe. This marvellous engine was made by the Davy brothers in 1905 to drive Charles Camel's armour plate rolling mill at Grimsthorpe's works. This supplied the shipbuilding industry with tough armour plate steel. For many of us, this engine and its setting epitomise everything we think we know about the Industrial Revolution. The growth of big cities, huge advances in science and technology, the harnessing of labour, energy and capital to make mass-produced goods for markets around the world. What probably doesn't come to mind when we think about industrialisation is alcohol. But Pete Brown, one of the world's leading writers on beer and columnist for the Sunday Times, begs to differ.
I think it's astounding how important brewing was to the Victorian industrial era. I mean, I did Victorian history to A-level at school, and the brewing industry wasn't mentioned once. We learned all about coal, we learned all about steel, but brewing was the second biggest industry in terms of contribution to GDP in the second half of the 19th century. Behind cotton, I think it was. The tax on malt was, I think, the biggest contributor to tax revenues for the government. So that's how big brewing was, and we're just not told about it at all these days. It was absolutely massive and really influential on the economy.
This was partly due to sheer necessity. After 1800, there were many more mouths to feed, and beer remained a key part of everyday diets. The population of England grew from about 5.7 million in 1750 to 8.3 million in 1801 to 30.5 million in 1901, with the populations of Scotland and Wales also trebling.
I think beer drinking peaked around the 1870s, 1880s, but before that, it was just what everyone drank on a daily basis. There's a lot of speculation about whether people drank it because water was unsafe to drink. If you were living in the middle of a city, certainly our access to clean drinking water was limited. Also, it was a vital source of nutrients. It's full of B vitamins. It's quite calorific. Small beer was served institutionally in hospitals, in workhouses, in schools. You're talking about 1 or 2% ABV, so you couldn't get drunk from it.
Virginia Berridge is Professor of History and Health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. She notes the special link between alcohol and towns.
Although Britain was a hard drinking society, people drank harder in some places than they did in others. So there was a lot higher consumption in the towns and cities, I think, than there was out in the country. a dock worker in around about 1900 might have been spending about 8 and 4pence halfpenny on drink, which would be 5 times as much as the figure a worker would be spending in a country location.
But it wasn't just a case of meeting the unprecedented demand for beer. Since the 18th century, brewers had been at the forefront of new technologies and economies of scale. Pete Brown again.
Brewing was one of the main industries that drove the Industrial Revolution. Porter was really the first industrial beer, and the vats became huge. The Mer Brewery in the centre of London had one new vat. When it was completed, they had 200 people sit down to dinner inside the brewing vessel. They were that big. In 1814, this vessel exploded. It burst, and a tidal wave of beer swept through the slums in central London, killing 8 people.
This bizarre tragedy saw about 1 million pints of porter flood the slums around St Giles Church, which ironically is where Hogarth located his Gin Lane engraving, which we talked about in the last episode. But the technological innovations kept coming, allowing the standardised and reliable brews that we know today.
Brewers were early adopters of things like steam power, thermometers, the hydrometer that measures sugar content. The advances with coke smelting meant that you could produce pale ales reliably for the first time, because you have to kind of toast malt. We used to do it over hay or wood smoke, so you'd get a taint. Your malt would smell of smoke, and it'd be quite dark, it'd be uneven. And once we had coke, you could control the temperature a bit. You didn't get the noxious gases that were in coal. And so you could control the malting process a lot better, get pale malts. And so we had pale ale, and that became the sort of most fashionable drink of the 19th century, certainly.
Alongside innovations in the brewing processes and the creation of new types of beer was the emergence of a new retail landscape.
One of the most important innovations in this period was to sort of create a whole new type of outlet. These were known as beer houses.
Dr. David Beckingham is a cultural and historical geographer at the University of Nottingham.
And this came in with the Beer Act of 1830 that enabled people who wanted to sell beer, in effect, to go and buy a certificate from the excise. And the effects of this act were instant, almost 30,000, something like that. New venues for the sale of alcohol were added to the licensed landscape in the first year of operation of this act. And what you've done is you've created a whole new arena for the sale of alcohol.
Stepping back a little, Dr. Beckingham thinks the relationship between the Industrial Revolution and alcohol was twofold.
One is the industrialisation of the alcohol itself. And here we can think about the consolidation of the brewing industry in places like Burton-on-Trent, enabled by scientific ideas. In particular, in Burton, it was a story of what was in the water. And once you could replicate Burton water, you could effectively standardise beer production anywhere. You didn't actually have to be in Burton anymore. Or the coming of the railways, which enabled the creation of first regional markets and then national markets.
But this was only one aspect of the relationship.
The second is to think about all of those areas where temperance campaigners connected drink to problems that they associated with the Industrial Revolution. So here, living standards, health inequalities, real wages. People simply didn't have enough money left in their pockets because, say, they spent too much of their money in pubs. I think what we see in this period in particular is the emergence of new ways of thinking about alcohol and new ways of understanding alcohol's relationship to the sort of incipient problems that people seem to see around them.
The broad movement, known retrospectively as Temperance, was the most visible and vocal response to the social and economic problems associated with alcohol. I asked Dr. Beckingham how we should characterise this movement.
I think the first thing I would say about temperance is there is no one thing called temperance. The temperance movement is just a shorthand for lots of different groups that take a view on alcohol. So in its early manifestation, I think we're really thinking about moderation. We could be thinking selectively about, say, avoiding hard spirits. But as it kind of develops really in a northern English industrial context, temperance is associated with total abstinence, with a strategic decision to avoid the consumption of alcohol, and by extension, to try and avoid all the places that are associated with alcohol. It's to try and change fundamentally, morally, as it were, the sort of social setting in which people navigate everyday life. It means more money in the pocket. It means more money to spend on home and family. It's a version of betterment. It's fundamentally also connected, I think, to individual and collective pride. And that's really important for some of the communities we're thinking about.
Temperance believed in the improvement of both the individual person and wider society. And it was very much based on ideas of community and collective action, that ordinary working people were better off joining together, helping each other cooperatively.
You can see origins here often associated with things like nonconformist religion. We can see origins also in things like burial societies, in savings clubs, in a kind of sense of real care, not just for oneself in the now. And this is a really important point, I think, about temperance, but a really obvious sense in which people were thinking about the future. They're anticipating a better future for themselves, for their communities, for society, and ultimately, I guess by extension, they would have thought Britain would have been a better place in the future through the growth of temperance.
It's not difficult to see how these principles contributed to ideas about popular citizenship.
So in the 19th century, we're coming up with a new kind of settlement between the state and society. We're progressively extending the franchise. Temperance is offering us a way to work towards political citizenship, qualifying for the right to vote and so forth. You're offering people a way to demonstrate that they qualify because they understand what being a citizen is. It isn't somebody who's idle and sits in a pub all day and fritters away their money. It's somebody who is investing sensibly, carefully, in a view of the future that isn't just about them.
And these are citizens, men and women, with a practical agenda.
It becomes increasingly, I think, by the 1850s, political. So no longer just simply moral and social or religious or about individual betterment. And so then you see this really interesting, I think, attention towards public drinking, policing, licensing, and you get political organisations, I guess most notably the United Kingdom Alliance, which was formed in Manchester around about 1853-54, really beginning to agitate for the state to do more in the arena of drink restriction.
So in the face of the literally industrial amounts of alcohol flooding across British cities, working men and women seek to moderate or even eliminate their own drinking and the drinking of others. In the process, temperance becomes a way of identifying and dealing with the broader social problems of industrialisation and modernisation, and a way of working for better futures. It turns ordinary people into citizens. And of course, to get things done, citizens need to get political power. Professor Berridge from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine explains how the drink issue mapped onto party politics.
Temperance, in particular, became an issue very much associated with the Liberal Party, and the Conservatives became very much more associated with the brewers and with trade interests, which made a good kind of political battleground. So there was a clear dichotomy between the political position on drink of the two major parties at the time.
It's been estimated that more parliamentary time was spent debating alcohol than any other issue, aside from Irish Home Rule in the decades before the First World War.
The Liberal Party wanted local areas to be able to vote to go dry, basically. So a lot more emphasis on localism than we have in politics in the present day. Back in 1893, the Liberal leader, Harcourt, introduced a bill which would have done this and also would have denied the trade the right to financial compensation. But that bill failed.
The politics of drink in Britain was part of a growing international struggle, with British activists and associations in touch with campaigners in the USA and Scandinavia in particular.
They kind of knew about each other, and there was a lot of transfer between, people going to speak in different countries, literature going from one country to another, and so on. And in Northern Europe, there were different attempts to do something about the drink trade. There was a lot of interest in kind of municipal control, which also had its parallel in the UK with the emphasis on the local veto and local option.
Within the city archives, we've got hundreds, if not thousands, of maps of the city. But this one stands out for its purpose and its markings of places where you could buy alcohol across the city.
To pursue this idea of local control over the drinks trade, I visited the Sheffield City Archives to meet up with the Chief Archivist, Pete Evans. From one of the drawers in the archives, Pete revealed an extraordinary visual representation of the alcohol situation in Sheffield at the end of the 19th century.
This was printed in 1884. It's known as the Sheffield Drink Map, printed by a local company, Pawson and Brailsfords, and on the map is marked every establishment where you could buy alcohol, identified by either a dot or a cross. The red dot is an on licence and the red cross is an off licence. There are hundreds and hundreds of these establishments right across the city, from the industrial end to what we would now call the suburbs, etc.
The map's production was part of a national mapping campaign by the Temperance movements, a sort of political strategy to shock people into realising the proliferation of pubs and beer shops.
It's a great visualisation undertaken by the Victorians to really map out their concerns around consumption. Who could fail to be probably quite surprised at the number of places where you could buy alcohol? On almost every few yards there's a place. And if we look on the reverse of the map, I'll just turn it over now. We've got a graph of the amount of money that is spent on intoxicating liquor, which is looking like £136 million across the UK in 1 year. And on the graph, in comparison, are life's essentials such as bread, sugar and milk, and rent for housing. And those are much, much less, as you can see, than the alcohol consumption.
And it's a very powerful representation. A huge black column of intoxicating liquors towering over a much smaller list of life's necessities, which people are obviously not spending so much money on. The map was most likely copied and circulated among local civic leaders, as well as those of neighbouring cities and the public in general. The rise in local concern and control is also illustrated by another document which Pete produced from the archive drawer. It's a fancy letter of congratulations from several Sheffield Temperance societies to their new mayor.
In 1887, William Johnson Clegg was elected mayor of Sheffield. He was a teetotaler, and when he was elected mayor, the Sheffield organised temperance societies presented him with this beautiful illuminated manuscript congratulating him. They say this is another manifestation of the striking success of the temperance cause, which is securing throughout the land. So you can see they're clearly enthused and encouraged by William Clegg becoming mayor, leader of the town. There are 11 temperance societies listed on this manuscript. You can see from their names they're extremely local, almost on a street level basis. And we have two examples, Eyre Lane Temperance Society and Thomas Lane Temperance Society. And given this document is only 3 years after the drink map was drawn up, we can actually see on the map lots of red marks on these particular streets.
By the left, slow, march.
For all this local politicking, It took the outbreak of the First World War to break the national political deadlock between the Liberals and Conservatives over alcohol in Britain. As with the Boer War before it, recruiting, training and supplying an army focused attention on the links between drinking and health.
The First World War was a very interesting period because there was a belief that the heavy consumption of drink was affecting the war effort, that workers were drinking too much and, they needed to work hard in the factories, in munitions and so on. And so the idea of nationalisation of the drink trade came onto the agenda. That didn't prove to be a nationwide policy, but there was state control of the drink trade in Enfield in North London and also in Gretna in Scotland.
Why Enfield and Gretna, you might ask? Well, these were places where there were huge munitions factories, and the government didn't want alcohol interfering with the production of ammunition. So here, breweries and pubs were taken into state control. Elsewhere, there was also a high degree of state regulation.
A central control board was set up in 1915, which could regulate the drink trade, without further ado. And that brought in things like the famous afternoon gap, where pubs had to close down after the lunchtime drink, and they didn't open again until the evening. And of course, that was something that lasted right until the 1980s, I think. They also abolished the practice of treating, where workers would go in or soldiers would go into a pub and everyone would buy them a drink. You weren't allowed to do that. You weren't allowed to intoxicate someone by treating them. It reduced the strength of spirits, and there are lots of other measures that affected the drink trade. But interestingly, the Central Control Board was a joint enterprise between temperance people and the drink trade, a very unusual wartime alliance. It also had a strong research dimension. It had a research board which funded a lot of very interesting, very good research on alcohol, which was one of the first instances of that sort of initiative.
This state-sponsored research is a reminder of another kind of response to the industrialisation of drink in the 19th century, what might be termed the medicalisation of the problem.
There wasn't a kind of concept that people talked about which was called addiction, but certainly the medical profession was becoming much more interested in drink consumption in the 19th century, and theories of disease, which had different names, began to come on the scene. And they started to talk about what they called a disease of the mind. So it was a disease, compulsive drink consumption, but it was a mental disease rather than a physical disease.
These ideas about alcohol dependency combine the most recent thinking about the mind with a strong moralism. Compulsive drinking was a kind of medical disease and a moral disease. The theories were developed internationally, and in Britain they began to influence the temperance movement. Groups of medical men and others became activists.
In the 1880s, a significant organisation was founded called the Society for the Study of Inebriety. And in fact, at first it was called the Society for the Study and Cure of Inebriety. They were very optimistic that that could be achieved quite quickly.
The cure bit would be dropped in time, but this crusading group of medical practitioners set forth to change the way drunks were treated. Its first president was Dr. Norman Kerr, and in his inaugural address he stated that
inebriety is a true disease, as unmistakably a disease as is gout, or epilepsy, or insanity.
The Society's members were interested in both medical therapies, but also social reform. Dr. Berridge again.
They started to campaign to kind of take the drunkard out of prison, because people who were prosecuted for being drunk, who were drunk and disorderly, would go in and out of prison all the time. It's what people later came to call the revolving door. So they wanted to stop that and produce some hope of cure. The way they wanted to do this was by setting up what were called inebriate reformatories. So really a prison under medical control rather than penal control. And they campaigned from the 1880s really until up to the First World War to try and get compulsory committal of drunkards who came regularly before the courts.
Their approach to habitual inebriation was scientifically innovative. It was about removing drunks from their normal environment, putting them in a retreat of sorts, and replacing their drinking with sporty activities and a healthy diet.
One of these, which was set up, was the Dalrymple home at Rickmansworth, which at that time was a country town. And the idea was that they would be there for quite a long while, months, even years at a time, and they would be re-educated into healthy pursuits, cricket, tennis, a bit like a country house weekend, and then would be brought back into society, cured. Well, now we can see they were very optimistic about the possibility of that occurring in that way. But there was tremendous optimism about that at the time.
Unfortunately, while the treatment may have been enlightened, it was also prohibitively expensive. The doctors wanted a state-funded system, but of course that didn't happen. If alcohol in 19th century Britain was inextricably linked to industrialisation, as cause and consequence, then attempts by moral, social and medical reformers to turn all aspects of drinking into a political issue point to the emergence of what social scientists sometimes call the biostate and biopower. This is when political authorities become deeply concerned with, and involved in, the physical and mental health of their populations. When issues like diet and disease, and living conditions and public health become a central element of the remit of government. The industrialisation of alcohol not only helped to precipitate these developments in Victorian Britain, it did so from the bottom up as a kind of popular citizenship rather than top down. But the story has something of a surprising twist in the tale, because after the First World War, it's not alcohol which becomes subject to international treaties, but rather drugs. Up until the 1868 Pharmacy Act, drugs such as opium and morphine had been freely available. You could literally get hold of them at the corner shop. And whereas alcohol was considered a major issue in 19th century Britain, drugs weren't. But everything switched after the First World War. In Britain, alcohol all but disappeared as a political issue, despite the introduction of prohibition in the USA.
When it came to the peace treaty, the Treaty of Versailles, it was drugs which came into that treaty and not alcohol. And the reason that was because the peace treaty incorporated a pre-war piece of legislation, international legislation, called the Hague Convention. Now, there was no similar piece of international legislation for alcohol. So despite the strength of prohibition in the United States in the 1920s, there really wasn't a lobby of quite the same strength to incorporate alcohol in any type of international control. So a big difference between the two substances. And of course, international control of drugs has continued. It's still in operation today.
This difference, at least from a British perspective, might in part be due to the relative success of Temperance in challenging the place of alcohol in British society, even as the industry grew and consolidated. From the 1870s, alcohol consumption began to decline, and even beer lost its grip on our everyday diets and routines. Booze was now big business, but it increasingly had to fight and advertise for its markets. In the meantime, the biostate would become a pervasive feature of modern life.
Phil Withington, ending our fifth moment in 5.5 moments when alcohol shaped the world. I'm Dr. Nick Grote, and I've been struck by hearing about the many ways in which alcohol affected everyday lives during the Industrial Revolution. The temperance movement changed the way many lived and socialised. You can still see this in the physical geography of cities around the UK, an abundance of former temperance halls, chapels, hospitals and coffee houses. I'm also interested in the changes in medical thinking across the world in this period. The realisation that alcohol addiction was both a mental and physical disease and could be treated with rehabilitation, still so relevant today. Phil's last point, the idea of the biostate increasingly controlling and managing what we consume, leads us nicely into our final episode of 5.5 Moments. We turn to the present day. Are we in a moment now? Join Phil and I as we investigate innovation, individualism and abstinence in the 21st century.